Bom dia, estamos aqui com o Patrick Miller, cientista político e professor da Kent State University. Nice to meet you.
Thank you. You too.
Com a volta de Donald Trump à presidência dos Estados Unidos e um cenário mundial voltado às eleições que aconteceram na última terça-feira, dia 5 de novembro, é um prazer termos um cidadão americano e especialista em política para falar um pouco com uma visão mais clara sobre os resultados e impactos que esse novo mandato trará para o mundo. Nice to meet you, Patrick.
Thank you. You too. Thanks.
Nossa entrevista vai ser em inglês, mas você pode ligar as legendas a qualquer momento. Patrick, so now he's going to start. If you need, we can repeat anything.
Okay.
So our first question is like an overall question. Could you explain to our audience what the electoral college is, how different it is from the Brazilian system, which is like direct voting?
Okay, how complicated do we want to get? So when our Constitution was adopted in 1789, our founders were setting up a very new kind of democracy that really had not existed in the world before. And they were thinking about, well, how is it that the old states of Europe often chose their leaders? And what was very common in Europe in those centuries was to have some kind of system where people didn't participate. People didn't commonly vote the way that they do today, but rather the elites of society gathered, and that small number of individuals chose a leader. So actually the way a pope is chosen today is actually an electoral college, where it's the cardinals, the elites of the church, who select the leader within a very small group. Elections were not very common around the world in 1789. So that was a normal kind of system to them. This was also a time when education and literacy were not as common among Americans. We didn't have mass communication. So our founders were not necessarily accustomed to or even that comfortable saying that the average American should be directly electing our president. So they set up a system similar to what they had known in Europe, where a small number of elites got to choose that person. And so in our system, the states are very important. So the states are given a certain number of votes that is equivalent to the number of members they have of our House of Representatives, which is the lower chamber of our national legislature, the Congress, plus 2 seats for the Senate. So, for example, my home state of Virginia has 11 members of the House of Representatives plus 2 senators, so it has 13 electoral votes. Overall, there are 538 electoral votes, and the way that you become president is to get a majority, which is currently 270. And so in almost all of our states, well, I should say we have changed over time. At the start of our republic, it was the expectation that state legislatures would choose the electors and that people wouldn't vote directly for the electors. But now, over time, we've moved to a system where American citizens, we vote within our states, and typically the person who gets the most votes in that state gets all of the electors. So if Donald Trump gets 1 more vote than Kamala Harris in Ohio, he gets all of the electors from Ohio. And so that's why on our map you see states are red for Republican or blue for Democratic, because the Republican or the Democratic candidate has won all of the electoral votes from that state. So that's currently how we elect our president. So Americans go to vote. The top vote getter in the state gets all the electoral votes, and if you get a majority of electoral votes, you become president. If nobody gets a majority, then Congress gets to decide who's president. So it's obviously very different from a system like you have here in Brazil, where you actually vote directly for president. We don't vote directly for president, we vote for the electors. And so in your system, you vote directly for the person, and then you might have a second election if no one reaches a certain percent. All of our other elections in America work similarly to that, where we vote directly for a senator, for a House member, for a governor, and the person who gets the most votes wins. And sometimes in some of our states, we have a system like yours, where if nobody gets 40% or 50% of the vote, you might have a second election. But we have this one office, the most powerful one, that we elect very differently, and sometimes it's very painful to explain to people from outside of the United States how it works, because it can be confusing even to a lot of Americans, especially when we have a situation where the person who got the most votes didn't actually become president, which has happened twice in my lifetime. In 2000, the Democrat Al Gore got, I believe, about 500,000 more votes than George W. Bush, the Republican, but Bush won the Electoral College and became president. And then in 2016, the Democrat Hillary Clinton got about 3 million more votes than Donald Trump, the Republican, but he won the Electoral College, so he became president. A situation like that wouldn't happen in almost any other democracy, but it's how we do things.
Thank you.
Sure.
Considering the change in leaderships and potential shifts in priorities, what major political and diplomatic alignments can we see in the international stage? Could we see like a shift in U.S. approach through alliance, trade accentments, or stance on key like climate change and security partnerships?
Oh wow, there's a lot. So we only have two parties in the United States, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. They are quite different in what they stand for. Traditionally, they are more similar on foreign policy, but that has changed a lot. So when you go from one party to the other, especially today, there can be very dramatic changes in both policy within the country, but policy looking outward, foreign policy. Your audience might not be as concerned about, changes within the United States, but we will probably have a number of policy changes that will then probably indirectly affect the world. So our current president, Joe Biden, is very concerned about climate change. We've had a lot of policies under his administration to reduce CO2 emissions, to create international partnerships. Donald Trump is very different. Donald Trump has publicly said he doesn't believe in climate change. He doesn't believe humans play a role in it. He's called it a hoax. He withdrew us from the Paris Climate Treaty. His domestic policies are not very concerned about limiting CO2 emissions. He made that less of a priority for his government. So, the difference between Biden and Trump is very much about whether the United States will be a country that promotes attempts to rein in climate change or not. And like if Trump's first term is any indication, then that will not be a priority for the United States. Donald Trump would like to institute tariffs, like higher tariffs on all imported goods. He's even floated reducing income taxes in the United States and instead replacing that with tariffs. That will have a big consequence for trade. With tariffs, so a tariff is basically a tax on an imported good that is passed on directly to the consumer, so me. We import a lot of things in the United States. We are Brazil's second largest trading partner. So if we put a higher tariff on the goods that you are exporting to the United States, those become more expensive for me as the consumer. I might then choose to buy a cheaper product, perhaps made in the United States, and that makes it harder for Brazilians or Mexicans or Chinese to do business in the US. So that's a policy that could have very big impacts on people in other countries. Trump has talked a lot about different policies dealing with our national debt and how we pay that off and whether we can increase it. It's a lot of economics to explain, but that will have some impacts on Brazil. You are a country that actually buys a fair amount of our national debt. When we go into debt as a government, we issue a bond. About 75% of the American national debt is owned by Americans, but about 25% is owned by foreign countries. Japan and China own the most, but Brazil owns a substantial amount of that. So if there is any risk to our debt, if it becomes any less of a reliable investment, that will impact your country. Obviously, if there is any change in our economy, a healthier or a worse economy, because of some of the policy changes that Trump has talked about, I'd say he's talking about some very large economic policy changes, and it's very hard to predict what effects that will have. Often, large policy changes, markets don't react very well. And so think about something like what recently happened in the United Kingdom when Liz Truss, the Prime Minister, had a lot of economic policy changes, and it basically caused a recession. Now, if the UK goes into recession, that might not affect too many other countries. If we go into recession, that's going to impact the world. To talk about foreign policy, I'm sorry I'm talking about so many things, but there are just so many stark differences between what a Democratic president would stand for and a Republican president would stand for. First you have to let's talk about Israel. Both parties are pretty pro-Israel. Donald Trump had a very hands-off policy with Israel, let Israel do what it wants. Biden put more pressure on that. Neither party, neither Harris nor Trump, was going to stop arms shipments to Israel, rein in Israel. We don't control Israel. I mean, I think people think we do. We don't. Israel has a strong military without us. Yeah. But the difference would be that Trump is a president who does not want to pressure Israel with regard to its war in Gaza. Now, Biden tried, but he didn't. There was no teeth to that. There was no punishment when Israel crossed certain lines. But I think Israel will certainly feel more free with its military actions with Trump. Certainly there's a lot of attention to the relationship with China. We are traditionally an ally of Taiwan, which feels militarily threatened by the People's Republic of China. Trump has been more skeptical about our military defense obligations with Taiwan, so there is concern in Taiwan right now that if China were to attack it, would we defend Taiwan? That's going to be something to watch. Traditionally, both of our parties are very pro-Taiwan, so the Taiwanese are very uncertain right now. Talk about Ukraine. We are the largest supplier of military and financial resources to Ukraine right now. Trump has promised to cut that off. He has said that his approach to ending the war would be essentially to force Ukraine into a bargaining position. I think there is widespread belief in the United States that once our aid stops, Ukraine may likely fall to Russia. Of course, the European Union is still going to be sending aid, even if we don't, and that may keep Ukraine alive for a while, maybe even permanently. But if our aid is cut off, then that's going to make Ukraine's situation much harder. I will say that's an area where Trump may not be able to do everything that he wants, because many people in his party in Congress are still very supportive of Ukraine, but he also has this chunk of people who are not. So that'll be something to watch. And I'll say the last thing will be our relationship with NATO. So NATO is our military alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We operate on a principle that an attack against one is an attack against all. We were founded as a deterrent to the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, and now Russia. I'm sure your viewers will know Russia is rather aggressive militarily. Ukraine is an example. Ukraine is not in NATO, so we do not have a defense obligation to them. They have been interfering in the Moldovan elections. Moldova is not in NATO. However, Putin has made various statements about recognizing the independence or not of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. That's NATO. Russia has routinely made military air incursions into Finland, Poland. That's NATO. There have been other threats against Poland. Right now, if Russia were to attack a NATO country, we would be obligated by treaty to come to their defense. That doesn't mean nuclear war, but the idea is if the United States, as the strongest member of NATO, if our threat is there, if our nuclear deterrent is there, then we keep Russia in check. If we leave NATO, or if we back away from our defense obligations, then that isolates Europe more. They're more on their own. And there is still potential for conflict there. Russia may feel bolder to attack Europe if we will not defend Europe, but as I remind people, France and the United Kingdom have nuclear weapons as well. And we certainly don't want to be in a position where there's a nuclear exchange or a military exchange between the European part of NATO and Russia. But I think Russia may feel quite emboldened if we back away from NATO. So there are a lot of things, a lot that will, I think, directly impact Brazil and other countries, but also just change perhaps some of the balance of power in the world, where some conflicts may emerge or escalate that could be of concern to a lot of people. And I really just say, Trump is very different, even from traditional Republicans, in his views on Russia, on Taiwan. And so many of these areas of potential conflict around the world, there traditionally would be more consistency between a Republican and a Democratic administration. It's like the difference between Bill Clinton and a Democrat and George W. Bush, a Republican, and then Barack Obama on any of these was very minimal. But Trump is very different from a traditional Republican on how he thinks about tariffs or Russia. And so that really introduces the possibility for some very dramatic differences.
Okay. Yeah.
My next question is kind of like about those two wars that are going on. Because to me, I didn't see that much sense about Trump's position on pulling back from Ukraine because of the NATO. Like, it seems like the whole thing started because Russia kind of got here that Ukraine was thinking about joining NATO, so that's why they invaded, to prevent it from happening. So to me, it seems like the smart thing to do would be to give support to Ukraine. But then Trump says, no, we're putting too much money in that. They're not even part of the group. Meanwhile, for back in 2018, for Israel, he even declared like the capital of Israel is Jerusalem. So it seems like those two wars, going forward, are going to have a very different treatment for Trump. What do you think? Like how he's going to treat each of those fronts?
I mean, we can't say perfectly. So I'll say, I mean, let's take Russia first. Russia has a pattern of aggression against countries, not even necessarily militarily, but say interference in elections. So like with Ukraine, for example, I think in Russia there was a period, once the Soviet Union dissolved, you had people like, say, Boris Yeltsin, who was president of Russia at the time, who they were okay with that. I mean, the Soviet Union was kind of like a United States in some ways. I mean, the different regions didn't have much power, but they were a union of smaller republics. And someone like Boris Yeltsin would have said, well, we can still be friends and align, but you can have your independence. Putin is very different. Putin, publicly, he talks about the glory that was lost with the old Soviet style. Not necessarily praising communism, but the power that Russia had as an entity at that point in time. He's talked about countries like Estonia or Ukraine, where there are ethnic Russian populations. He talks about them as if they're part of Russia. I think his attitude is more of if Russians live there, that's Russia. And so then Russia has a right to not just be interested, but have an influence. And he often says, even to the democracies of Eastern and Central Europe, like Poland or Romania or the Czech Republic, that used to be in the Warsaw Pact, he often uses languages that is threatening against them, as if he somehow intends to pull them back into the fold of where they were. And I'm not trying to be anti-Russia here, but Putin is aggressive and authoritarian.
As a good ex-KGB agent.
Yeah, and he's very different from Boris Yeltsin.
Yes.
And so there is more to the Ukraine-Russia conflict than just Ukraine possibly joining NATO. I mean, that was certainly something that Russia did not want to see. But even prior to any of those concerns and Ukraine really pressing to join NATO, Putin really didn't recognize the independence of Ukraine. There was interference in their elections. Fun fact, in the 1990s, Bill Clinton actually approached Boris Yeltsin about Russia joining NATO. But of course, that didn't happen. There was no formal invitation made. So I think there's much more to that conflict than just, is Ukraine in Russia or in NATO or not? NATO was reluctant to admit Ukraine because that threat from Russia was known, and I think there were some member states that thought if we admit Ukraine, we're basically inviting a war with Russia. So that didn't happen. I think at this point, the question is, does Ukraine survive as an independent country? Or if it remains independent, is it actually independent or just a puppet state of Russia? That's, I think, the debate that's on the table right now. And then if Ukraine falls, what's next, if anything? With Israel, Trump has a very hands-off approach. And I'll say, I think there's a misperception in the world that we, as a country, the United States, that we somehow prop up Israel. I mean, we give them, they are a friend, they are an ally, we appreciate that, right? Politically and economically, militarily. But they were a strong military before we ever started helping them. I remember, this is a country founded in 1948, I believe. They fought off a number of countries invading them, trying to conquer them by themselves. We did not help. So they were strong before we developed that relationship with them. And so our aid to them is not necessary. It helps, but it's not what makes them strong. They also have nuclear weapons. We did not give them nuclear weapons. I mean, I just want to make that clear. They developed them independently. So Trump is very hands-off, but I think people outside the United States, there's often that stereotype that we are what props them up, and that's not true. Traditionally, there is an approach in the United States, a bipartisan approach of being friendly with Israel, giving them assistance, but also pressuring them to the peace table. And that was true with Democratic and Republican presidents, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, the first Bush, Bill Clinton, where be friends, but also pressure your friend to make peace. And there were some very famous agreements that came out of that. George W. Bush, the Republican president prior to Donald Trump, started this policy of backing off from that pressure, but still not entirely. Trump has taken that even further. Trump's attitude is more of, let Israel do what it wants, we'll give them assistance, but we don't need to be pressuring them. So I think if you're Benjamin Netanyahu, you feel very free under Trump to do what you want, and you're not going to get that pressure back against you. I'll also say Netanyahu has become a polarizing figure in the United States. Traditionally, Israeli prime ministers stay out of American politics. He has not. He did not like Barack Obama, not a fan of the Clintons, not a fan of more moderate Republicans. He certainly has been a fan of Donald Trump. Jewish people in America, they love and support Israel, but you look at surveys, they do not like Benjamin Netanyahu, right? So there are tensions there. And I think in Trump, Netanyahu sees both a personal friend, but also someone who's going to give him a lot of freedom to do what he wants. And that will be a little bit different from what's happened historically.
And talking a little bit about far-right movements, we saw in Brazil and United States the rise of strong political far-right movements. Mm-hmm. Do you think that it's a thing that contributes for this, or it's like a cultural thing, or historical circumstances?
Well, there is something happening in the democracies of the world right now, many of the democracies of the world, where you have the rise of these far-right movements. Mm-hmm. They're often concentrated on the more conservative side of politics. So we are only a two-party system. So of course, in our system, that's going to gravitate into the Republican Party. In systems that have more than two parties, sometimes it floats between parties. Sometimes the far right in a country even makes its own party. Mm-hmm. In the United Kingdom, for example, the far right has at times been its own party with the United Kingdom Independence Party, UKIP. They were a third party in this most recent election, but they're also slowly integrating into the Tories, the Conservative Party. Of course, they have their own party in France, the National Front. The common thing between these parties is the kind of cultural politics mixed with more populist working class economic appeals. Yeah. It works a little bit differently in a lot of countries. Unfortunately, in the world right now, this is not just in the United States. In the last 30 years, many working class people, even middle class people, have been very economically stagnant. I think in many countries, 20 or 30 years ago, if you are struggling in the working class, you might have had more faith that politics could help you, could fix you, but it hasn't. And I think when you have some of these far-right figures, whether it's Marie Le Pen in France or whatever, they act a little differently, they speak differently, they often say more outlandish things, and that makes them seem different. And I think if you're frustrated with politics, if you if you feel like you're not getting ahead and you're cynical that these conventional politicians will help you, you might think that someone who acts a little differently, speaks a little differently, might be the key. So I think that's part of the appeal. But often these far-right parties mix that with the more cultural appeal. So it's not just it tends to be economically populist, but it's often mixed with kind of anti-immigration politics. And the tenor of that works differently in different countries. In a lot of Europe, it's anti-Muslim politics, anti-Middle Eastern immigration. In some parts of Central Europe, it's anti-immigration from Eastern Europe, like we don't want Ukrainians coming in. But there is this common sense that the identity, the culture of the country is being threatened by these others who are coming in, or sometimes people within society, like feminists or gays and lesbians or racial minorities that want social change for themselves that would change society from traditional ways. And I think where you see this culture and economic appeal often put together is when those politicians, they marry them by saying, well, maybe you're not getting ahead economically because of immigrants, right? So they'll say, well, they take jobs, or they cause inflation, or something like that. So those two things may not go together economically, but I think it is useful to have somebody to blame. And that ends up being a very consistent kind of message with right-wing populist movements that you see again across countries, and often very effective based on how many of them we see come into power. I will say in our system, because we have two parties, and each of the parties are big coalitions of different groups, it has been interesting within the Republican Party to see more traditional, non-populist Republicans struggling against this kind of right-wing populism that Trump does represent. In his 2016 primary, he beat a lot of mainstream, more traditional conservatives, Jeb Bush, Chris Christie, Marco Rubio, people who would have been very conventional, normal Republicans who would have given Hillary Clinton a good run for her money. He didn't have a very strong challenge from the more conventional Republican wing this time. He had a couple people run against him who really never had much of a hope. So it's been interesting within our politics to see even people who are not the kind of right-wing populists realizing that they have to find a way to dance with that politics, right? How to navigate that. And even if that means changing their own beliefs sometimes because they want to get ahead in the party.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So now I have a question more about ecology, sustainability.
Okay.
So more and more we have seen Elon Musk getting closer and closer to Trump, seems like at least. Even
the what getting closer?
Elon Musk.
Oh, Elon Musk. Okay,
Elon
Musk.
Getting closer.
Yeah, all right.
At the same time, Trump was just elected for a second term, and there's some things that he left behind from his first term. One of them being a lease to dig oil or gas in Alaska that was stopped during Biden administration. But now that Trump's back, do you think he's going to keep focusing on trying to dig things or trying to go after fossil fuels
yeah.
within America, or is he going to steer towards electric to appease this new ally of his?
Well, that's a very interesting question. So that's the best way to answer this. The United States has become actually one of the most prolific countries in the world with fossil fuels, which we didn't used to be in terms of production. That is an important part of our economy. Traditionally, though, in both parties, and left and right, there has been openness to energy production through a variety of means. So, more traditional conservatives, they wanted policies that were good for coal, good for oil, as did Democrats, right? But there was a bipartisan openness to promoting solar, wind, other forms of alternative energy. Over time, especially as climate change has become a bigger issue, you have seen some polarization on that. It's not that Republicans have been anti-wind, anti-solar, anti-renewable. but they have moved much more strongly towards really strongly supporting the traditional fossil fuels. Sarah Palin, who was John McCain's candidate for vice president in 2008, had a famous quote when she was supporting oil. It was "Drill, baby, drill." And that was about drilling for oil in the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge, right? And that's kind of become the motto of people who look at the energy politics in that kind of way. The Democrats have not become anti-coal, anti-oil, but they've moved towards tilting their policies more towards the renewables. So that will be an interesting thing to see with Trump, because he was following that trend of really tilting more towards fossil fuels, but he's making these alliances with people who are making money off of renewables. I think there's going to be some tension there. Business leaders in America are very much in favor of any form of energy that's going to make money, basically, right? There are many activists in our politics who almost see energy as a cultural issue. It's not about the money. It's not about even CO2. It's about traditional fossil fuels, oil, coal. That's American, right? And alternative forms of energy, they're liberal, they're hippie, they're less American, right? And on the left, it's the inverse of that. It's the renewables are the future. It's pro-environment, help the world, right? And it's a big stigmatization of the traditional oil and coal. So it's interesting to see kind of the people who treat energy as almost a culture war issue, like abortion or gay rights or immigration. They see it in the same kind of vein, often in conflict with the business-oriented people who favor anything that's going to make money. I think that's going to be a conflict for Trump to navigate, just given where his politics has gone, the friends he's making, and the politics in the Republican Party these days.
Do you have a grasp which direction he's going?
Oh, I would not venture a prediction. There are, with any of our politicians, Trump, Biden, they say things on the campaign trail, and you have to often see then how that gets translated into actual policy once they're in office, and there are a lot more pressures on them, and I would not venture a guess. No.
Thank you.
Talking a little bit about fake news, we have saw a lot of campaigns spread fake news in the social media here in Brazil and the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Does the US has protection to not spread informations in the voting days?
So you're talking about whether we have any laws that prevent the spread of misinformation?
Yeah, like in the days of the voting.
We do, but they're rather limited. And I would say in the United States, so we have freedom of speech in the United States, and the way that is interpreted, as you do in other countries, right? But it means something different in different places. So in our country, our courts have interpreted freedom of speech to mean that we give the maximum protection to political speech, but not other forms of speech. So we really cannot regulate political speech in America, but we can regulate economic speech, we can regulate obscenity. But our protections for political speech mean that we also protect lying. We protect hate speech on social media, right? So that's something that's been a source of conflict. Like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, they're privately owned. Our protections for freedom of speech are about limiting what the government can do. So the government can't stop hate speech, but if Twitter or Facebook does not want it on their platform, they can take it down because that's their space, they own it. And that's been a source of controversy as those platforms have regulated that speech or not, with Elon Musk, letting that speech go out. So if someone is lying about politics, or if it's spreading of misinformation, intentional misinformation, we really have, and it may depend on the case and exactly what's going on, we have very little power, maybe even no power to stop that or regulate that. I know in other countries you absolutely can regulate that. Now, if it is speech that is intentionally trying to harm the right of people to vote, Now that's a little bit different. So for example, there is an unfortunate history of people, for example, going into black neighborhoods, people who don't want black people to vote, and distributing flyers that say, Election Day has been moved to Wednesday and not Tuesday, right? Something like that. Mm-hmm. And most people are not going to believe that, right? But anyone, black, white, whatever, rich, poor, who maybe doesn't pay enough attention to politics and doesn't realize that Election Day is always Tuesday, they might believe it. But if you target that at a certain group of people, then that impact's going to be more limited to that population and people who are susceptible to that within that population. So that is the kind of speech that we do have a little bit more room to regulate and punish, because the intention is not just to mislead, but prevent people from exercising their right to vote. So our ability to stop that is very, very narrowly tailored. But we, because of our speech laws, we have to tolerate a lot of things that in other countries, including I believe in Brazil, like you would stop, you would regulate.
Like we have with the Twitter here. I don't know if you know about this, because we have laws and Elon Musk was following the laws. So he took off the government took off the Twitter for like 2 months, I think.
Yeah, we cut them off for quite some time.
Yeah.
Right.
Including for the first roll of votes for like mayor elections.
Right.
Yeah.
That would not happen in the United States. I mean, just to take that even further, we know that Twitter and other forms of social media are a primary platform, let's go back to Russia, for Russian disinformation. That's a real thing. That's not a paranoid American thing, right? They use social media to spread disinformation and to spread their message. Mm-hmm. We know that, but we cannot stop those platforms from existing. We can't shut them down. We at all. We can't even force them to take down just the Russian disinformation, because our laws are very hands-off with political speech. But again, if Twitter or Facebook want to do that themselves to police what is their property, it is their right.
Okay.
One last question. So immigration.
Okay.
It seems like Trump got a lot of votes for like these other demographics that did not vote for him in his first election, and that were traditionally Democrat, like more like the Democrat side voters.
Sure.
Like black and brown and like actual immigrants. Will Trump change his policies or his speech based on the results of this last election?
I doubt it. I mean, let's be clear, right? So I think especially from talking with my students, we think about race a little bit differently in America. In America, we're much more likely to put people into a box: white, black, Native American, which I guess you might call indigenous here, Hispanic or Latino, Asian. We also have far fewer Americans who are of a mixed race background. I think in Brazil, you have a large chunk of your population that is mixed race. I mean, my students were telling me, for example, I had a student today tell me that like, I look white, but I have black grandparents. That would be very unusual for an American to say, because your family is more likely to be white or black and not be mixed. So race is a very important divide in our politics. The biggest divide is Democrats versus Republicans, and then it's religion and then race. Minority voters have traditionally been more Democratic. In this election, Trump really did not do any better with black voters than he had previously, but he did make improvements with Asian and Hispanic voters, particularly Asian and Hispanic men, particularly if they're younger. And that probably comes from a variety of reasons. I don't know how interested your audience might be in that, but like, in America, if you're white and you're more religious, you're often more Republican. If you're a minority and you're more religious, you're often more Democratic. So young people are often less religious. And so if you're white, that makes you more liberal. If you're not white, it often makes you more conservative. So the fact that younger minorities are actually getting less religious actually helps Republicans, even though they're the more religiously conservative party. It's a lot to process. Part of it also might be, if if younger people across races are struggling more economically, they might be thinking more about the kind of economic populism messages. And so again, if you're a young Hispanic and maybe the racial identity and all of the social ties that come with that aren't as pressing for you as they are with your grandparents, who are more likely to vote Democratic, you might be thinking more about that kind of economic alienation, the economic populism. There are some people who speculate that it's the whole machismo thing that has been helping him with young male voters of all racial backgrounds in the United States, but particularly Hispanic voters. I don't think we have one definitive answer for why that's been the case. And I'll say, even though Asian and Hispanic voters, they are traditionally more Democratic, they still voted for Kamala Harris. It's just Trump had improvements in those groups. I don't think he's going to adapt his policies at all to cater to or recognize that change, because he made those improvements despite being very anti-immigration, despite, there was the big controversy around the speaker at his rally in New York City, I believe, who called Puerto Rico a floating island of trash. And I think there are some Americans who maybe, they just think of it at the level of race, and they say, well, if this is the kind of rhetoric, they're very confused about why someone from that racial background might vote for someone from that party. But we have to recognize that anyone who's in any group, Catholic, white, gay, whatever, right? They're not all the same. They're not monolithic. There's a division of interests there. Might surprise your viewers to know most American Catholics favor abortion rights and they favor same-sex marriage. That would surprise even a lot of Americans who know that the church is against those things. So I think if I'm Trump, I'm probably thinking, I made those gains in that population despite what's been said about immigration, despite what's been said at rallies, despite some of the things that Trump himself has said about Hispanics in particular that a lot of people perceive as racist. So I don't think there's going to be a change there because he's made those gains in spite of the controversies. I think, of course, you always have to see how things pan out. I mean, he's promising mass deportations of undocumented immigrants. He's promising even to deport people who were brought to the United States as children, who we've traditionally protected from deportation. They're called dreamers, that's the popular term. And of course, Trump has often said contradictory things. Like he said, we'll leave NATO, we won't. I'll deport these people, I won't. So it's like, you have to see with him, just like any politician, I think he contradicts himself a little bit more than most, but with any politician, you have to see how the words translate to policy. It's just with him, I think there's often more contradiction. So I think we have to see, how the rhetoric on immigration then translates over to actual policies in terms of how many deportations, who's being deported, what does the arrest and roundup and detention process look like? And then see, does that cause controversy within our Latino or Hispanic community or our Asian community? I think to the extent that that happened in his first administration, it wasn't as visible, maybe even not as high priority. If it's more visible, more aggressive, more controversial in this second term, then that could spin out in ways that could affect politics in the future.
I could add extra question about the relation with the United States government right now and Brazil. You think it's changed a lot or not?
I mean, the United States and Brazil have been friends, allies. Certainly our relationship with you is a little bit different from many of our allies. You're not in NATO, for example, so we don't have that military relationship with you that we would with Canada or France. Just the history of our involvement in the world, we were very isolationist for a very long time. We were pulled reluctantly into World War I. We tried to be isolationist again. We were pulled reluctantly into World War II. And then after World War II, we tried to be isolationist again, but then we were the strongest democracy after the war, and we found ourselves in this position to be leading NATO countries against Russia, right? So our concerns have been traditionally towards Europe, and then with the rise of China economically especially, China, Japan. I think we have certainly had involvement in Latin America and Brazil and Central America, not as extensive. And so I don't want it to sound like we've ignored the region, we've ignored the friendships. Certainly not. It's just Russia and China have kept us busy for a very long time. Yeah. But I think we have that positive relationship with the country. I think when you had Trump and Bolsonaro together, they were very similar in a lot of ways, saw each other as friends perhaps, and that affected that made that relationship perhaps a little bit different. I don't think that there is any anti-Brazil sentiment. I'm not in Trump's head, right? I don't know if he looks at Lula negatively because of the politics in your country. Not to the extent that I know. But I think if I'm in Brazil, I would expect the United States to continue to have a friendly relationship with you. And in fact, I think Brazil, you try a little harder to be friendly with countries that we are more antagonistic with. Like, we do not have a good relationship with Iran. You have a better relationship with Iran. So it helps to have friends who you can, if we don't talk to Iran directly, it helps to have you all as a friend who can do that. We're not currently getting along with Russia, but you all try to have a different kind of relationship with Russia that, Brazil, you have to navigate that for yourself, and is that a good or a bad thing? But that can be a useful thing for us in our interests. So I don't think there'll be a change there, but I do think if, for Brazilians, come back to the issues I talked about earlier, especially tariffs. If there are changes in our policies, especially around trade and tariffs, it's not meant to be anti-Brazil or anti-whatever country, but that is going to affect you in a lot of ways, positively or negatively.
Encerramos por aqui a nossa entrevista, mas deixamos um agradecimento ao Patrick e à American Academy por essa oportunidade, e até a próxima!